My name is Alexis Monroe. I am 29 years old. And on New Year's Day I found out exactly where I rank in my own family. That morning I walked into my parents' living room with a bag of specialty coffee from Seattle in one hand and a bakery box of pastries in the other. The house smelled like cinnamon and fresh roast. Torn wrapping paper littered the floor. Everyone was laughing. My mom was admiring a new kitchen gadget. My dad was talking up some high-end grill. My sister, Brianna, was already staging photos of her spa gift set for Instagram. My 9-year-old niece, Suddy, was buried in a science kit. At some point, my name was mentioned. I sat on the edge of the couch and waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. No one handed me a present. No one asked if maybe mine had already been opened. It was like I was just background noise in a movie about their perfect life. Finally, as casually as I could, I said, "So, did I miss my name?" My mom gave me that tired, irritated look I know too well. "Why would we spend money on you anymore?" she said. "You walked away from what matters to this family. You do your own thing now. You're basically a guest out of habit." Brianna let out a short laugh. "At least now you finally get it," she added. "You're not really on our level these days." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I stood up, set the coffee on the table, told them they'd need it more than I would, and walked out into the cold January air. By sunset on January 1st, I was back in my Seattle apartment, staring at the financial app I'd built, the one that tracks every dollar running through my family's coffee shops. The day ended like that. At 8:30 the next morning, January 2nd, a single box landed on my parents' front porch and blew their perfect little world apart. If you want to know what was inside that box, and how the daughter they treated like she didn't exist ended up holding all the power, stay with me to the end. 5 years earlier I was 24. Broke by most people's standards, but somehow the only one in my family who understood how close we were to losing everything. Monroe Roasters, the small coffee chain my grandparents started in Portland, was bleeding out. My mom, Caroline, still ran the day-to-day like always. My dad, Dennis, kept signing off on equipment loans we couldn't afford. Everyone talked about how loyal the regulars were, as if good vibes could pay overdue invoices. My older sister, Brianna, was the golden child, posting latte art on Instagram and calling herself the face of the brand. I was the one who had moved to Seattle to write code, the child who had supposedly walked away. I remember the night I opened their books for the first time. I was at my tiny kitchen table in Seattle with a cheap takeout dinner, staring at a spreadsheet that made my stomach drop. Rent was behind at one location. Supplier payments were being shuffled around. My parents' entire plan boiled down to, "Next month will be better." I had just signed my first real contract as a software engineer for a fintech startup. For the first time in my life, a decent amount of money sat in my bank account. Instead of celebrating, I drove 3 hours down I-5 to have an uncomfortable conversation with my parents about numbers they didn't want to see. That was the night I became the majority owner of Monroe Roasters. We sat around the old dining table my grandparents had bought decades ago, and I laid it out as calmly as I could. I would use my savings to pay off the most urgent debts. In return, they would transfer most of their shares to me. In exchange, I'd design a new point-of-sale system, wire every register in every shop to a single cloud dashboard, and track every dollar in and out. No more handwritten notes taped to the espresso machine. No more mysterious cash that never hit the bank. My mom hated the idea of me controlling the numbers, but she hated the thought of foreclosure more. My dad signed because he assumed it was temporary. Brianna signed because mom told her to. I drove back to Seattle the next morning and started coding. For months, I lived a double life. By day, I worked on payment tools and risk models at my job. At night, I built the Monroe dashboard, a system that pulled live data from each register, logged every transaction, and reconciled it with inventory and bank deposits. When it finally went live, I stood in the back of the flagship cafe with my laptop while my mom rang up a line of regulars. Every card swipe and phone tap appeared on my screen in real time. Tiny proof that the bleeding could stop. We stabilized. Bills got paid. The scary letters slowed down. My parents kept the house in the suburbs. On paper, I had saved the family business. In reality, I had just postponed the inevitable and given them a tool sharp enough to cut both ways. What didn't change was how they treated me. At a family barbecue to celebrate turning things around, My mom wrapped an arm around Brianna in front of a group of customers and said, "She's the heart of Monroe Rowers. We'd be nothing without her." Then she nodded vaguely toward me, standing off to the side with my laptop, and added, "And Alexis does the computer stuff. Whatever that is." Polite laughter. I smiled because I was used to it. I had been the kid in the back since I was 10, the one tinkering with wires while my sister charmed the room. Now I was still the kid in the back, except I owned most of the room and had a live feed of every sale running through it. For a while I told myself that was enough. I'd saved them once. I had done my part. Then came New Year's Day. That night, after walking out of that gift exchange and flying back to Seattle, I opened the same dashboard I'd built to rescue them and saw a pattern that didn't make sense. Gross sales at each location were high. Bank deposits were strangely low. The cash column looked like someone had been shaving little pieces off it over and over for a long time. I scrolled back month after month and watched the gap widen. My family hadn't just disrespected me. They had been using the system I created to quietly hide money, confident the girl who did computer stuff would never say a word. At 8:30 a.m. on January 2nd, a plain brown box landed on my parents' front porch in Portland. I was 200 miles away in Seattle, watching a progress bar crawl across my laptop screen. The night before, after I'd seen the cash gaps, I stayed up exporting everything I needed from the system I'd built. Every cash sale, every card swipe, every deposit, every missing dollar. Neatly organized into files that told the truth more clearly than I ever could. I loaded those files and a lightweight offline version of my app onto a USB drive. I printed a few pages of summary reports and tucked them into the box with a single sticky note. Plug this in. No signature. No explanation. Just numbers. A same-day courier picked it up from my building and drove south while I sat there wondering if I was being petty or finally honest. In my parents' kitchen, I could picture my mom topping off her mug, my dad scrolling through the news, my sister checking comments on her holiday posts. When the doorbell rang, Suddy probably ran to the window and yelled about a package. Brianna would have opened the door, seen the lonely box, and carried it inside like a late gift. She'd tear the tape, flip the lid, and then freeze. Inside, the USB stick. Printed reports with the Monroe Rowers logo across the top. Page after page of columns showing sales, deposits, and a growing field labeled underreported. I wasn't there, but I know my sister well enough to imagine her calling for our mom, her voice climbing a little higher with every word. Mom would have wiped her hands on a dish towel, annoyed, until she saw my name in the tiny footer of each report. Generated by Monroe Analytics, a Lex Monroe tool. I did that part on purpose. My dad would have taken the stack, flipped through, and gone pale when he realized the dates went back years. Long before that New Year's Day when they decided I wasn't worth even a $20 gift card. Somewhere amid the confusion, they would have seen the line showing how much money should have hit the bank and how much actually did. The difference wasn't a rounding error. It was a pattern. At some point my mom must have tried to call me, because a notification flashed on my screen for half a second before it disappeared. Blocked. Then my dad called. Also blocked. A text from Brianna came through. "Are you serious right now?" 3 dots appeared. Then nothing. My phone sends muted numbers into a quiet folder I never open. While they crowded around the kitchen table with those pages and that USB, arguing over what could be explained away and what could not, I opened the same reports on my laptop and scrolled. I watched the numbers like I was watching an old wound finally get stitched closed. For years they had taken me for granted, telling anyone who would listen that I was just the kid who played with computers, while they did the real work. Now every corner they'd cut and every dollar they'd skimmed was laid out in a format designed for bankers, auditors, and tax agents. I still hadn't decided who I was going to show it all to when I hit save and closed my laptop. But one thing was suddenly crystal clear. For the first time in my life, my family needed something from me more than I needed anything from them. Brianna showed up at my Seattle apartment the next afternoon like we were just two normal sisters grabbing coffee after the holidays. I watched her through the peephole for a moment. Expensive coat, phone in one hand, reusable cup in the other. She looked more like an influencer on a brand deal than someone whose entire business had just been dissected on paper. When I opened the door, she gave me a too bright smile. "Lex, can we talk?" My first instinct was to shut the door again. Instead, I stepped aside. She did a slow lap around my living room, commenting on the view, my framed hackathon badge, my second monitor. Like she was seeing proof that my life was real for the first time. Then she put her cup down and dropped the act. Mom is freaking out, she said. Dad too. Her voice had that tight edge it gets when she's scared but trying not to show it. They found your name on the reports. They know it came from you. I leaned against the counter and waited. We thought you just helped with the loans, she rushed on. We didn't know you actually owned most of the company, or had some back door into everything. That's not how any of this works, I said. You all sat at the table and signed the papers. You knew exactly what I was offering and what I wanted in return. She waved that off like a boring detail. They're saying this is going to cause a huge mess with taxes. That you blew it up over nothing. Over a rough holiday. Nothing. A rough holiday. I saw my mother's face again from New Year's Day. That blank look as everyone else opened gifts, and something inside me clicked into place. Brianna must have seen it because she shifted tactics. Look, she said more softly. You know how things are run. Cash is just easier sometimes. People have done it like this forever. And Suddy loves her school. She loves her friends. If this gets any worse, we could lose the house, the shops, everything. Do you really want to be the reason she has to pack up her room and say goodbye to her whole life? I almost laughed. It was textbook. When we were kids, Mom used that move all the time. Wrapping every argument in guilt and family and tradition until you couldn't tell where your feelings ended and hers began. I thought about Suddy with her messy ponytail and that science kit, about how none of this was her fault. For a second my resolve wavered. Then I remembered the numbers. Years of underreported cash. Years of them signing my name as an officer on tax forms while quietly skimming from the business I had saved. You're not putting this on a 9-year-old, I said quietly. You and Mom and Dad made these choices. Not her. Brianna shook her head like I was being unreasonable. You changed, Alexis. You left. You chose tech and strangers over your own family. And now you're punishing us for not throwing you a party every time you come home. There it was. The old script. I had walked away from the only thing that mattered. I was ungrateful. I owed them loyalty forever because we shared a last name. I flashed back to a winter morning when I was 15, standing in the back of the original Monroe rowers with a battered laptop on a milk crate. I had stayed up all night teaching myself to build a simple online order form that sent drink choices straight to the bar. I showed it to my mom proud. She chuckled and told me to put it away before I scared off the regulars. People come here to talk to us, not to a screen, she said loudly enough for the whole line to hear. Then she called Brianna out front to practice steaming milk and chatting up customers while I faded into the back and pretended to do homework. I didn't know it then, but that day set the tone for the next decade. Brianna was the face. I was the background. Now the background had receipts. Back in my apartment, I straightened and met my sister's eyes. I'm not doing this to you, I said. I'm done covering for decisions I didn't make. If there's nothing to hide, the numbers will match. She opened her mouth, then closed it, grabbed her cup and headed for the door. This isn't you, she muttered. You used to be the one person I could count on to put family first. I let that hang there for a second. Maybe putting family first is what got me into this mess, I said. After she left, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than it had the night before. I sat down, opened my laptop and pulled up everything I'd exported. The reports, the logs, the email threads where my parents casually referred to pulling a little extra cash this week. My name on the corporate documents saying I was responsible if anything went wrong. I dialed the number of a business attorney in Seattle that a coworker had once recommended half-jokingly when we'd talked about worst-case scenarios. This time it wasn't a joke. I explained who I was, what I'd built, and what I'd found. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since I first saw the discrepancies. If I know there's tax fraud happening in a company where my name is on the paperwork, and I stay quiet, does that make me complicit? She didn't sugarcoat it. It doesn't look good, she said. And if it blows up later, they will absolutely try to throw you under the bus. She walked me through my options, including something I'd heard of in passing but never really considered. The IRS whistleblower program. I spent the rest of the day reading everything I could, checking the requirements, comparing them to my data, making sure I wasn't crossing any lines with privacy or hacking. I had admin access. I had built the system. I was entitled to those reports. By the time the sun went down over Seattle again, I had written a detailed statement, attached the files, and filled out the online submission. Not as a bitter daughter, but as a majority shareholder who no longer wanted her name attached to a lie. Hitting submit wasn't dramatic. No thunder. No music swell. It just felt like stepping out of a burning house I'd been told to pretend was fine. Maybe real family would have cared that I was the one suffocating inside it. Several months later, the first white envelope from the Internal Revenue Service showed up in my parents' mailbox. Everything that had been whispered around the kitchen table now had an official letterhead. I didn't see their faces, but I heard about the fallout from my cousin, who worked part-time at one of the shops. He texted that my mom had gone quiet in the middle of a rush, walked into the back room with a letter, and came out with eyes so red the regulars noticed. The notice itself was standard. A small business audit. The IRS wanted to take a closer look at a few years of returns for a company that, on paper, seemed more profitable than its bank accounts suggested. For a normal operation, it would have been scary but survivable. For Monroe Rowers, with its carefully hidden cash and a majority shareholder who had just filed a whistleblower report, it was a slow fuse on a much bigger explosion. My parents reacted exactly how I expected. They hired a local tax attorney, printed their own version of the numbers, and tried to construct a story where the deposit gaps were all innocent oversights. They talked about informal cash bonuses, handling tips off the books, little favors for employees that never made it into payroll. The plan, from what I could piece together, was simple: blame sloppy bookkeeping, lean on emotion about being a family business, and hope the IRS settled for a slap on the wrist. My name came up when the attorney asked who had built their system. That was the moment this stopped being a private family mess and became something I couldn't ignore. An IRS agent called my Seattle number one morning between meetings. She introduced herself, confirmed that I was the majority shareholder and system architect, and asked if I'd be willing to answer some questions about how the Monroe Rowers point of sale worked. I closed my office door, sat down, and said yes. We scheduled a video conference. A week later, I sat in a plain conference room at my fintech job, a glass wall behind me, my laptop propped just far enough away that I didn't have to stare at my own reflection. On my screen, the call split into 3 panes. In one, my parents at the dining room table in Portland, Brianna beside them. The same chandelier hung above them that had watched over every Christmas, every birthday, every fight. In another, the IRS agent, her supervisor, and the tax attorney my parents had hired. In the third, me. The agent started with the basics. How long had I been a shareholder? When had I implemented the POS system? What kind of access did I have to the data? I answered carefully but honestly. I explained that each register sends every transaction to a central database in real time, that each sale is logged with a timestamp, payment method, and amount, and that the system automatically generates daily reports comparing sales to bank deposits. When the attorney tried to suggest that sometimes the sync might fail or the logs could be incomplete, I asked to share my screen. Using sanitized demo data, I walked them through the dashboard, the transaction trail, the reconciliation view, the error logs that flag failed syncs. The agent took notes. My parents just stared like they were seeing what I'd built for the first time. Once the structure was clear, the questions changed. Had I ever discussed discrepancies between reported income and what the system showed? Had anyone ever asked me to alter numbers? I said I had noticed smaller red flags in earlier years and brought them up in vague terms, only to be brushed off with jokes about how cash is messy. I added that I had never changed any data, never deleted transactions, and that the system intentionally logs any edits so they can't be hidden. That was when my mom broke down. She dabbed at tears that didn't smudge her makeup and leaned toward the camera. "We're just a family trying to keep a small business alive," she said. "We're not some big corporation. Maybe we made mistakes, but we're not criminals." My dad jumped in about the pressure of making payroll, rising rent and supply costs, the temptation to hold a little cash back just in case. Brianna tried a different angle, blaming my system. She called it confusing, said none of them really understood it, implied that some of the discrepancies might be my fault. A misconfiguration, a misunderstanding between me and their accountant. I let them talk. When the attorney glanced at me, silently asking if I wanted to respond, I took a breath and kept my voice level. The system doesn't misplace cash. I said. People do. I pointed out that the underreported amounts weren't random. They followed a consistent pattern that always benefited the same people. The agent asked if I could provide export files to back up what I was saying. I already have, I told her. They should be attached to the whistleblower report I submitted months ago. Under my own name. The silence that followed was longer than any I can remember between my parents and me. The attorney cleared his throat, realizing for the first time, it seemed, that I wasn't there to tidy up their story. I was there to draw a very clear line between myself and what they had done. The next few weeks blurred into paperwork and quiet, simmering tension. The IRS requested bank records, vendor invoices, years of receipts. They cross-checked my exports against actual deposits. Every time a new gap appeared, another letter went out. Every time a letter went out, my parents tried calling or texting. I blocked another number. While all this chewed through my family's life, my own in Seattle took an oddly upward turn. My boss pulled me into a meeting to say that a paper I'd co-written about small business fraud detection had been accepted at a fintech conference in San Francisco. They wanted me to present the case study I'd anonymized, built off Monroe data, with all the names and drama stripped out. I booked a flight, wrote a talk about how transparent technology can protect owners and employees alike, and tried not to dwell on the irony. On the day I stood on stage in a hotel ballroom explaining to founders how underreported cash can hide in plain sight, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my cousin in Portland. I didn't listen until late that night. When I did, his voice was shaking. The IRS had just finished a key meeting with my parents and their lawyer. The words fraud and penalties had been used in the same sentence, more than once. It was no longer a question of if something would happen, only how hard, and how much of it they'd try to pin on me. By the time the hammer finally fell, it was late summer, the kind of sticky Portland heat that makes everything feel heavier. I was at my desk in Seattle when the email arrived from the IRS agent. The audit was complete. The underreported cash wasn't a misunderstanding or a clerical error. It was a pattern, and it was going to be treated as one. A few days later, my cousin sent me a photo of a thick envelope on my parents' kitchen table. Inside was the official determination. Years of back taxes, civil penalties, interest that had been quietly compounding while they pretended everything was fine. It was more than Monroe rowers could absorb, even in a good year. And this was not a good year. Customers had already been drifting away for months, unsettled by rumors and the tense atmosphere at the counter. My parents tried to hold it together at first. They called emergency family meetings, ones I was never invited to. They talked to banks about restructuring loans, to landlords about rent relief, to anyone who would listen about being unfairly targeted. None of it changed the math. For sale signs started appearing. First went the smallest shop, the cozy location near the university where I had done my homework as a kid. Then the flagship cafe downtown, the one my mom always called her second living room. Equipment sold at a discount. Furniture went for less than it was worth. Anything to scrape together enough cash to keep the penalties from swallowing them whole. The house was next. The big craftsman in the suburbs that had hosted every Thanksgiving and birthday. The place I had driven away from on New Year's Day with a bag of untouched coffee in my hand. They packed decades of photos into boxes and moved into a small rental on the other side of town. Somewhere cheaper. Somewhere they didn't have to run into people who remembered them differently. The fallout wasn't just financial. My dad started seeing a cardiologist after his blood pressure spiked so high during a checkup that the nurse refused to let him leave. My mom stopped posting cheerful photos from behind her counter, because there was no counter left that belonged to her. The regulars she once greeted by name drifted to other coffee shops. The women she used to brag with about small business ownership stopped inviting her to brunch. Brianna tried to write it out online, pivoting from family coffee brand content to generic lifestyle posts. Sponsors quietly backed away when they realized the charming coffee empire in the background was now a cautionary tale. The cracks in her marriage to Tyler, always there beneath the surface, split wide under the stress. He resented being dragged into a mess he hadn't created. She resented his refusal to pretend it would all magically fix itself. Within months they were separated. Then divorced. Suddy went from a large bedroom in a good school district to a smaller apartment in a new district where no one knew her last name. Somewhere in the middle of all this, my parents tried one last time to cast me as the villain. My phone lit up late one night with a number I didn't recognize. I answered without thinking. "You did this," my mother said before the connection fully stabilized. Her voice was hoarse like she'd been crying for hours. "You tore this family apart over some numbers on a screen and a hurt feeling from a holiday. We lost everything because you couldn't let it go." I let her talk. I let my dad come on and add his quieter version about friends who no longer called, employees who had moved on. "You know they never would have looked this hard if you hadn't pointed them our way," he said at the end. "You turned your own parents in. That has to mean something to you." "It does," I said. "It means I'm not willing to go down for choices I didn't make. You signed my name on those returns. You used my system to hide cash and assumed I'd stay quiet because we share DNA. That was your bet. You lost." There was more arguing, more guilt, more appeals to tradition and loyalty. But nothing they said changed the fact that the IRS had made its decision and Monroe Rowers was gone. When the call finally dropped, I sat staring at my reflection in my dark laptop screen and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not joy, just a clean, sharp kind of relief. I was out. Shortly after the last shop sold, I received paperwork to transfer my remaining shares to the buyer, a regional coffee group that had picked up the brand name and a few locations. I signed everything electronically. A few days later, the wire hit my account. It wasn't a fortune, not after debts and penalties, but it was enough. Enough for a down payment on a small house near the river in Portland, with big windows and a spare room I could turn into an office. Enough to seed the savings I'd started after realizing family was not a safety net. I moved back to Oregon on my own terms, not to my parents' couch, not to the shadow of the old Monroe Rowers sign, to a quiet street where no one knew me as the daughter who walked away from the family business. I brought my monitors, my worn hoodie, and the same laptop I'd used to build the system that changed everything. I set up my desk facing the water and opened a blank document titled, "Next." Officially, I was still a senior engineer at my fintech company. Unofficially, I had started sketching out my own product, a tool to help small business owners spot exactly the kind of fraud and sloppiness my parents had wrapped in the language of survival. There was a certain symmetry to it. They had used my skills to cheat the system. I was going to use those same skills to help other people keep their books clean. Months later, as fall crept back into the Pacific Northwest, I walked past one of the former Monroe locations on my way to meet a friend. The sign had changed. The menu was different. The baristas were all new. No one recognized me. No one knew my last name had once been painted on those windows. I stood for a moment watching customers line up for their drinks and felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude. The place that had defined my childhood was gone. The version of me that needed their approval had gone with it. The people who hurt me had paid a price I didn't have to collect in person. I turned away and kept walking toward a life that finally felt like mine. The first morning I woke up in my little house by the river. The light came in soft and gray through the blinds. For a second I forgot everything that had happened. No smell of espresso beans roasting downstairs. No clatter of cups. No distant sound of my mother calling out orders in that bright, performative voice she saved for customers. Just quiet. My own coffee mug. My own kitchen. My own name on the lease. I made a pour-over with beans from a local roaster that had nothing to do with my family, carried it into my office and opened my laptop. The Monroe dashboard was gone from my bookmarks. In its place, a new project folder. The one I'd created the night I signed my shares away. A tool for small business owners who wanted transparency instead of convenient blind spots. A system designed to protect decent people from the same shortcuts my parents convinced themselves were normal. Building it was oddly healing. Every line of code felt like a tiny reversal of what had been done with the last system I built. Instead of hiding cash, this one highlighted risk patterns. Instead of making it easy for owners to skim off the top, it made it easy for employees to see when something didn't add up. I went to local meetups, talked to other founders, listened to baristas and bookkeepers tell stories about bosses playing games with numbers. I learned my family was not unique. The only unusual thing was that someone on the inside me had both the skills and the willingness to say, "This is wrong and I won't carry it for you." News about my parents in Brianna trickled in slowly after that. My mom took a part-time job at a mid-sized cafe across town, working the early shift, clocking in and out like everyone else. She no longer posted about being the heart of any brand. She just poured drinks and wiped counters. My dad rented a small unit in a complex near the freeway, cheap, anonymous. He went to doctor appointments, took his medication, and watched sports with the volume too loud. The friends who used to crowd our backyard for barbecues didn't visit the apartment. They sent the occasional text, then stopped. Brianna bounced between content gigs, trying to rebuild her persona without the Monroe Rowers backdrop. She still smiled into the camera, still talked about cozy mornings and grind culture. But the comment sections were quieter. The glossy narrative of a thriving family business had cracked, and there was no app filter that could fix it. Suddy started at a new school in a different district. I saw a photo once, forwarded to me by accident, her backpack nearly as big as she was, her hand in her mother's, her face turned slightly away from the camera. She looked small and braver than she should have to be. That night I opened a separate account in her name, one she doesn't know exists, and set up an automatic transfer from every paycheck. It's not some grand gesture. It's just a promise to myself that if she ever wants an education, or a way out, or simply a choice that isn't wrapped in guilt and obligation, there will be something waiting for her that isn't tied to anyone's secrets. People sometimes ask if I regret what I did. They almost always phrase it the same way: was it worth it? Did it feel good to watch them lose everything? The honest answer is complicated. It didn't feel good to see my parents' faces crumble on a grainy video call. It didn't feel good to hear the strain in my sister's voice when she realized there was no easy way out. It didn't feel good knowing a 9-year-old had to pack up her room because the adults in her life chose shortcuts over integrity. What did feel good was stepping out of a role I was never meant to play. I grew up thinking family meant absorbing every bad decision, patching every hole, and silently carrying the weight of choices I didn't make. It took an audit and an investigation with my name on the paperwork to understand that family without respect is just shared history. What I did wasn't revenge in the cartoon sense. I didn't slash tires or scream in parking lots or try to ruin anyone's life on purpose. I told the truth to the only people who could do something about it, and I refused to lie just because we share a last name. That was my revenge. I chose myself. I chose not to be the quiet, convenient scapegoat one more time. If there's a lesson in all this, it's not turn your parents in at the first sign of trouble. It's that loving someone doesn't mean helping them bury the damage they cause. It's that your skills, even the ones your family rolls their eyes at, have value far beyond their approval. And it's that protecting your own future is not betrayal when the alternative is letting someone else drag you under with them. These days my life is small in a way that feels peaceful. I write code. I walk by the river. I grab coffee with friends who see me as a person, not as a problem to fix or a resource to exploit. Sometimes I still pass one of the old Monroe locations and feel a pang. A flash of grief for what might have been if my family had chosen honesty. But the feeling passes. The relief stays. I didn't ruin their lives. I just stopped helping them hide the way they were ruining their own. If you've ever been the odd one out in your family, the disappointing child, the one they only call when something needs fixing, I hope my story reminds you that you are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose a life where you're not constantly paying the interest on someone else's mistakes. And if you were in my place, with your name on those documents and your work twisted into a weapon, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Or would you have walked away the way I did? Tell me in the comments. And remember, the first person you owe loyalty to is the one you have to live with every day.